this video, we're going to focus on America's foreign policy following the Civil War. Since the beginning of American politics, the foreign policy of our nation had focused on westward expansion and the limiting of foreign influence on the newly minted country. After the Civil War, American industrialization created a need for a fresh look at international relations. Rather than remain isolated from the rest of the world, which was a vision sparked early on by Washington in his farewell address, the U.S. became more and more involved in controlling territories that spanned from the Caribbean to the Philippines. This expansion of American power through diplomacy, and sometimes force, is normally referred to as imperialism. For the most part, we'll discuss America's shift from an isolationist policy to one of expansion by focusing first on the roots and causes of new imperialism, and then we'll give a glance at America's expansionist policies in the Caribbean and Pacific Islands. The imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was caused largely by factors associated with the industrialization of the Gilded Age. As American businesses continued to grow and expand, they required more raw materials. Initially, this wasn't a huge problem due to the wealth of materials available within our own borders. Quickly, however, disputes over ownership of those materials, as well as their rapid dwindling, led to a need for searching for more materials elsewhere. On top of that, American industries required more and more markets to sell their goods to. It was hoped that the active expansion and adventurous spirit associated with it would also help relieve some of the tensions created by the Panic of 1893. Conservatives in the government primarily feared that potential violent outbreaks from labor management disputes and unhappy farmers would happen. While businessmen were applying the idea of survival of the fittest to their competitive practices, different countries applied it to their races for military control, colonies, and spheres of influence. In the United States, imperialists saw expansion as an extension of the idea of manifest destiny into other areas of the world, but they also had to compete with other industrializing countries like Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and Japan. Tensions over this strict competition would eventually become one of the main causes of World War I, but we'll get to that later. For many, especially Republicans, imperialism and expansion seemed like a good solution to many of the domestic issues at home, especially those that centered on growing industry. But politicians weren't the only ones concerned about these things. Missionaries like Josiah Strong wrote that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASPs, were the fittest of the religious groups and were meant to colonize other places in order to spread Christianity to the less fortunate people. His ideology that white people were supreme over other races was shared by many missionaries during that century who traveled to the far ends of the earth to spread their gospel. Naval Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan also wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History that argued for a strong navy as a means of becoming a world power. U.S. naval strategists used Mahan's book to persuade Congress to fund the construction of modern steel ships and encourage the acquisition of lands that could double as strategic naval installations. And among all of these interesting developments, media editors found more exciting stories in the exotic nature of faraway places, which they used to sell more subscriptions. So let's go through what our imperialists and their opponents thought about expansion. Those who favored expansion did so for several reasons. First, imperialists wanted to take advantage of raw materials and new markets that other lands provided. After all, there are only so many Model Ts that you can sell to the American public. Second, they used racial theories based on eugenics and social Darwinism to say that white democratic nations were inherently better, and that they should be responsible for spreading their ideals to others. You may recall this general concept from world history as the white man's burden. You could also consider it as spreading the ideas of manifest destiny to the rest of the world. The logic behind all of those ideas is essentially the same. Third, the United States was in fierce competition with European nations over economic developments, so our expansionists wanted to make sure that we weren't falling behind the rest of the world's major players in the land grab game. And finally, imperialists argued that we must go beyond our own borders for raw materials and markets because, if you recall from Turner's frontier thesis, the Western American frontier supposedly had nothing left to be explored or conquered. So while imperialists like Presidents McKinley and Roosevelt hoped to expand through diplomatic and economic means, a group of anti-imperialists like Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie spoke out in opposition to these ideas. These men and others like them formed the American Anti-Imperialist League to challenge the ideas of their opponents using three major arguments. First, in response to the call for a larger navy, mostly by Mahan, they argued that a large military could potentially be dangerous as a threat to democracy. Second, they pointed out the obvious fact that if we truly believed in democracy, it would seem super hypocritical for us to go around trying to control other nations. They argued that each country in the world should be free to use self-determination to choose democracy for itself. And third, anti-imperialists used the historical argument that America had done very well for itself under the policy of isolationism, which, as they pointed out, originated from the mouth of probably the most American to ever live, George Washington. So these were the arguments that dominated congressional hearings and policy debates. And, as we already know, the imperialists ultimately won that fight when we entered the Spanish-American War in 1898. The Spanish-American War gave the United States direct control over Puerto Rico and established Cuba as a protectorate, which means that the U.S. kept their forces there in order to protect their investments. Congress chose to give Cuba independence but restricted their freedoms with the Platt Amendment, which gave the U.S. the right to intervene in their affairs at any time. These acquisitions led to increased American interest in the Caribbean region for three primary reasons. First, the U.S. wanted to control the Caribbean because they thought that if foreign powers took control over that region, they could pose a threat to U.S. security. Second, the region was one of the most important suppliers of agricultural products and a good market for selling American goods. And third, the U.S. realized after the Spanish-American War that if they wanted to be a naval power in the world, they would have to be able to move quicker through the oceans. This led to the call for a Panama Canal in Central America that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, rather than forcing ships to sail around the coast of South America. Probably the most difficult of these three goals was the building of a canal. The U.S. wanted to build a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, which geographically was the narrowest part of Central America. But when they went to get permission to build there, Panama was part of the country of Colombia, who would not allow President Roosevelt to build the canal there. Assuming that this might happen, Roosevelt had already struck a deal with the Panamanian rebels, who wanted independence from Colombia. When the rebels took action against the government in charge, the U.S. sent a warship to protect and help them. As soon as Panama became a country of its own, they gave the U.S. complete control of the 10-mile strip of land that they needed to build the canal. But getting permission to build wasn't the only problem. Throughout the building process, workers were struck with diseases like malaria and yellow fever, which were diseases common to the jungle regions in Central America. When scientists discovered that these diseases were carried by mosquitoes, Army officials ordered all swamps near the construction zone to be drained and any unnecessary vegetation to be cut down. So it seems that in a short amount of time, the U.S. managed to get a stronghold over a substantial amount of stuff in Central and South America. But what made this possible? Much of the success came from political moves made by Presidents Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. For his part, President Roosevelt chose to extend the Monroe Doctrine from way back in 1823 to the Caribbean in order to protect our economic interests there. If you recall, the Monroe Doctrine had originally told European countries that South America was off limits for colonization, and that the U.S. would go against anyone who did otherwise. Roosevelt made some additions to the original doctrine, called the Roosevelt Corollary, that essentially made the U.S. a police force in Central and South America. This way, he could make sure that he was collecting on debts owed to us by those countries. The Roosevelt Corollary quickly became known by another name, the Big Stick Policy, after Roosevelt bragged that he could walk softly and carry a big stick, a phrase that he once used when referring to hunting. In other words, the Roosevelt Corollary, or Big Stick Policy, was used frequently by Roosevelt to send troops to the Caribbean and Central America when he felt it was necessary. President Taft took a more relaxed approach to ensuring the success of American businesses in those regions. Rather than rely on force and intimidation, he encouraged bankers to invest in the countries of the Caribbean region. Because his policy relied so heavily on investments and economic means, it was commonly referred to as dollar diplomacy. However, if a loan by the U.S. government to a Latin American country wasn't repaid on time, Taft wasn't afraid to send in troops to get the money by force. This happened in Nicaragua. During his tenure as president, Wilson, for the most part, followed the pattern of his predecessors by sending in troops to Latin American countries in an effort to protect American businesses. For example, when Mexico went through a violent revolution, Wilson refused to recognize its new government as legitimate, since it was attained through heavy violence. When troops under Mexican rebel Pancho Villa murdered Americans in New Mexico and treated across the international border, he sent American expeditionary forces under General John J. Pershing to find them and bring him back. So the U.S. was obviously pretty busy in the Caribbean and South and Central American region. But after the Spanish-American War, America also controlled an empire consisting of the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Samoa, and Midway. While most of the territories won in the Spanish-American War were transferred to the United States as territories after the war, the history of U.S. interaction with Hawaii was a little different. The Hawaiian Islands once provided a refueling station for American ships and were a popular location for sugar and pineapple plantations. In the 1890s, the native ruler, Queen Lulukalani, tried to take back power from those American plantation owners. Her attempt ultimately failed, and she was overthrown completely in 1893. A local lawyer, Sanford B. Dole, set up and led a provisional government that tried to get the U.S. to annex Hawaii as a territory. Initially, President Cleveland refused to annex Hawaii because he thought the plantation owners' overthrow of the native queen was uncalled for. But after the outbreak of the Spanish-American War, Congress voted to annex Hawaii, most likely to continue using it as a fueling station. But the United States wasn't just interested in the Pacific Islands. Congress also pushed for influence in Eastern Asia, specifically China and Japan. In China, European powers had already carved out what they called spheres of influence, or areas where they enjoyed special trade and power privileges. While Americans had always traded in China, U.S. Secretary of State John Hay was afraid that the European countries could eventually shut us out completely. His solution was to announce an open-door policy, which gave equal trading rights to all foreign nations in China. Whether he could actually enforce this was really up for grabs, but he did send letters to all of the major European powers that declared his policy to be in effect. However, only a few months later, in 1900, a rebellion led by a group called the Boxers erupted in China as a response to Western influence. The Boxer Rebellion threatened the lives of foreigners living in China, which wasn't exactly what Secretary Hay was looking for, so he and other nations sent an army in to crush the rebellion. Just east of China, the U.S. also opened up Japan to Western trade and influence when Commodore Matthew Perry landed there with American gunships in 1853. This is mostly important because up to this point, Japan had been living in a state of isolationism, meaning that they didn't want to do trade with any Western nations. By the 1890s, though, Japan had adopted Western ways and became one of the first Asian countries to industrialize. They then went on to surprisingly defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, further solidifying their rightful place as a potential world power. So as we've seen, imperialists and anti-imperialists debated hotly over what America's role should be on a world stage. When imperialists won over that argument and involved the U.S. in the Spanish-American War, the results had a tremendous impact not only on the U.S., but on other nations as well. Specifically, the U.S. victory led to the acquisition of island territories in the Caribbean and Pacific, and increased involvement in Asia, and the suppression of a nationalist movement in the Philippines. The U.S. victory also, importantly, launched the U.S. onto the world stage as a major player in global events, a position that we will talk more about in our next lesson.